This one isn't for the faint of heart. I've taken hundreds, maybe thousands of 911 calls. This is the only one that no matter how much I try, I can never put it behind me. I've worked as a 911 dispatcher for the better part of 5 years now. It's certainly a weird job by normal day job standards, but most emergency responder jobs are, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I had a bit of a troubled upbringing, and I don't know why, but this job makes me feel like I have a genuine purpose. Being able to help people in need is powerfully gratifying and more rewarding than any other job I've ever had. For the most part, over time you get used to the weird and disturbing calls. Drunk arguments that somehow involve a samurai sword. People pissed off that somebody cut them off in traffic and they want the other person arrested. There are darker calls too, obviously, and after a while most of it just rolls off your back. But not all of it. Not this call. Roughly 2 hours left before I was out, I got a call from a woman in her mid-40s. Her voice was calm but clipped. Tense. She explained that her ex-husband had showed up at her property after a dispute they'd had during a phone call earlier that day. I asked if he'd made contact. She said no, he was just walking around outside. Not yelling, not banging on anything, just circling like he was looking for a way inside. She said he'd been doing it on and off for almost 30 minutes. I asked her if she felt like she was in immediate danger. There was some hesitation in her voice, but she told me no. She said he hadn't done anything yet, just periodically circled the house before returning to his truck. Allegedly, he'd been showing up randomly over the last couple weeks following their divorce. He'd call her, the conversation would get heated, he'd demand to talk to her in person, she'd say no, and he'd refuse to take that for an answer. Then he'd show up and just sit in his truck in her driveway or nearby on the road and either watch the house or get out and just stand there at the edge of the property smoking. And when he'd realize he'd been spotted, he'd peel out down the road. She said she'd called the police about it earlier that day and a unit did come by, but they didn't find him. I guess in her mind, she felt like this behavior would eventually fizzle out. I kept her on the line while I dispatched another unit. She stayed near the back window while we talked, then started describing what he was doing. He had walked behind the shed and then was heading back around the side of the house toward the porch again. And now he had something in his hand. He wasn't yelling or anything. She said he just looked like he was talking to himself. I tried to keep her talking and she did stay calm, but I could tell it was wearing on her. She said it felt like he was trying to get in her head. Just wanted her to know that whatever he was feeling was so intense that he couldn't help but behave like this. Then, she gasped. She told me he'd picked up a chair from the porch and was yelling at her to open the door. I could hear him screaming faintly in the background, and she started to yell at him to leave and that she had called the cops. Then, I heard the window break, glass shattering. She was screaming that he was climbing into the house through the window and that she needed help. I told her to get out right away. She told me that she was trying, and I could hear heavy breathing and that she was running while talking to me. Then, she was screaming again, and there was some kind of struggle on the other end of the line. There were banging sounds and slamming and screaming and yelling. Then, and this was truly the worst thing I've ever experienced at this job, in the exact detail I've talked with multiple counselors about because I cannot get it out of my mind. It was this horrible sound. It was like you could hear someone hitting a watermelon with a hammer again and again. And then it was just quiet. I kept calling her name, but there was nothing. The line was still open. I stayed on, trying to listen. I thought I might have heard footsteps, maybe someone breathing, but I couldn't be sure. The officers arrived maybe 4 minutes later. They radioed in almost immediately. Woman was down, unconscious, EMS needed. She didn't make it. Blunt force trauma. She was repeatedly hit in the head with something heavy. They found the ex-husband 2 hours later not far from the property. Cuts all over his hands and arms. Claimed he didn't remember how he got them. He's in jail now. You get a lot of bad calls on this job, and a lot of them you learn to push down, but hers wasn't one of those. The image that I can't shake in my imagination is her just standing there on the phone watching him through the window, watching him walk around, waiting for him to go away, hoping help would come in time. But it didn't. The sound of her voice and screams pop into my head sometimes. It's like a recurring nightmare that happens when I'm awake or trying to fall asleep. That one moment where everything changed for her. That was the last call she ever made, and I'm the total stranger who was on the other end. It's such a strange feeling to know I'm the last person in the world who she talked to before she died. It's the one phone call I can never forget. This happened maybe 2 years ago. I'm a patrol officer in a small suburban department. Been doing this about 10 years now. Not quite old-timer status, but long enough to have seen the usual range of strange and bad. I was cruising through one of the quieter parts of town. Average shift, mostly traffic stops and noise complaints. Nothing major. Early evening, dispatch radioed in a welfare check. A teenager had called in saying they thought someone might be in their house. Heard footsteps upstairs. They were home alone, parents were out of state. I remember having the thought that it was likely nothing. These types of calls usually are. Kid spooks themselves after watching a scary movie, or a squirrel gets in through a vent or something. But I said I'd head over and check it out. It was a nice little 2-story home. Everything looked normal from the outside. I could see that lights were on downstairs, but not upstairs. I parked out front and didn't even bother hitting the lights. As I walked up, the front door flew open. Kid looked around 15, maybe 16, shaky. Still had his phone in his hand. You could tell he was trying to keep it together, but that he was scared. He said he'd been downstairs when he heard what sounded like someone walking around upstairs. Light steps, like someone trying to be quiet. He said he'd called up the stairs, but there was no answer, so he'd locked himself in the laundry room until he heard my car pull up. I asked him if he heard a door open or any windows break, whether he knew if he'd left anything unlocked. The kid just shook his head. He told me that everything was locked when he got home from school and that they didn't have any pets. Nobody else was supposed to be there. His parents were on a trip for work somewhere out west. He had tried calling them but couldn't get a hold of them. I told him to wait outside, and I went in. It was a standard layout. Living room opened up into the kitchen, then a hallway toward the stairs. On the surface, nothing looked out of place. No signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints or anything like that. But you never know. It was totally quiet. Searching someone else's house in total silence is a very unique feeling. TV doesn't even get close to capturing it. It's a thick and heavy, eerie silence. You're hyper aware of every little creak or thunk. I announced my presence and was met with total quiet. I cleared the downstairs first, checked the pantry, closets, under the furniture, and behind the doors. All of it. It was clear. Then I made my way upstairs, and that's where things started to feel different. All the lights were off, whereas on the ground floor, not all, but most of the lights had been on. The kid told me that there should have been lights on upstairs and that he'd left them on. I could see at the end of the hall the master bedroom door was open a crack. The light was off inside, but I could see some cold evening daylight slipping in through a window. I got my flashlight out and turned it on, flipping on any light switches along the way that I could find. I made my way down the hall toward the master bedroom, opening up the rooms and closets along the way, stepping in to check them before returning to the hallway. When I finally arrived outside the master bedroom, I called in and announced myself once again through the cracked door. Then, I pushed it open and scanned my flashlight across the room and under the bed. The bed was unmade and looked slept in. That might have just been how they left it, but something about the room made the hair on my neck go up. I stepped in and swept the room. Nothing at a first glance. And then, I saw the closet door. It was just barely cracked open. Not wide, just enough to catch your eye, like someone tried to close it in a rush and didn't quite shut it all the way. I called out again. Standard warning, no answer. Then I crossed over to it, stepped to the side, and called out one last time. Nothing. Then I reached out and slowly opened the door. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just clothes. But it stank. I pulled the closet door open the rest of the way, and that's when I saw it. Between two suit jackets hanging from the rack, there was an eye looking back at me. I immediately yanked the rest of the clothing out of the way, and crouching there, trying to hide in the shadows, was a shirtless, emaciated man wedging himself in the corner of the closet. Wide, bloodshot eyes. His face was dirty and shiny with sweat. Looked like he hadn't slept in days. He was clutching a grimy backpack and appeared like he was either high or going through withdrawals. He didn't move, just stared at me, making weird whimpering noises. I ordered him out. He didn't fight, just kind of stumbled forward with his hands up. I got him cuffed, walked him downstairs, and radioed it in. A couple other units rolled in a few minutes later. Turns out the guy had come in through a side door that led into the garage, which the kid hadn't checked because he assumed his parents had locked it. There was no damage, no obvious forced entry. He just walked right in. It was unclear how long he'd been staying upstairs because the guy claimed he had just come in. But the teenager mentioned he thought he had heard footsteps upstairs the night before as well. We stayed until a neighbor showed up. Someone the family knew. Said the kid could stay with them until the parents got home. You train for all kinds of stuff on this job, but when something like that actually unfolds, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't terrifying as hell. People act like cops aren't just people too, who happen to have to throw themselves into all kinds of crazy situations with the utmost confidence without knowing who or what may be waiting for them. Pulling back that closet door and seeing that eye looking back at me was nothing short of terrifying, and no training could have prepared me for it. People think this kind of thing is rare, but it's not. Most people don't remember to lock every door. Most people don't double check their garage at night before bed. And most people think that when they hear a noise inside, it's just the house settling. I wish it was the case. That kid got lucky. If he'd gone upstairs instead of calling, who knows how it would have gone. The last time I saw my friend Pete was over 3 years ago out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. We went hiking on a primitive trail he'd found north of the mountains where we live. He had always kind of been like that, would find these primitive trails and either go by himself or drag me or another one of our friends along with him. Super introverted guy. You could just see him crumble when he tried to talk to people, so I think when he went out there in those remote places, to him it felt like he was finally free or something. In retrospect, it seemed like he'd been acting weird leading up to it. Kind of paranoid and moody, angry out of nowhere. Just different than I had always known him to be. I didn't consciously dismiss these things, but when people you've known for a long time start acting differently, you just kind of unconsciously look past it as flukes outside the baseline or something. But hindsight is 20/20. Anyway, he dragged me along for this day hike. Just the two of us, our backpacks, and a few caps of mushrooms we ate when we parked the car on the side of the road near the trailhead. I was never really big into hiking. I'm still not. But he had been pushing it for months and had unexpectedly fallen into the mushrooms, so he said to hell with it, let's go. He was the opposite of me, very into hiking and always over-prepared. He brought bear spray, a knife, a whistle, even some other stuff I didn't even know the purpose of. All this gear I would never consider necessary for a day hike. I remember feeling like he was being a little dramatic about it all. We weren't exactly going into the Amazon here, but whatever. It felt like he needed this and I wanted to be a good friend. The mushrooms didn't really hit until we were a couple miles in. It was light mostly. Everything just felt a little more alive. I was split between taking it in and trying to keep up with him because he was hiking faster than me. Finally, we stopped near a big clearing and decided to take a rest. We sat on a downed tree, ate some trail mix, got the mushroom giggles over a few things, and then just sat in silence, taking in the nature. I don't know how much time passed. Things got sort of internal for a while. It felt like a long time, but it honestly could have just been a couple minutes. Without saying much, it felt like his mood kind of shifted or something. Like his energy got darker the longer we sat there. Then, he said he had to take a leak, got up and wandered off the trail. I remember I sat there for a bit, just watching the sunlight like flutter through the leaves. My assumption was that he'd be back in a minute or two at the most, but he didn't come back. With mushrooms, your sense of time gets weird. I've heard it called time dilation. A couple minutes can feel like a very long time, and I wasn't really sure how long he'd been gone, so I checked my phone for a baseline and continued waiting. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I stood up and called out for him, but there was no response. Then I started feeling this swell of anxiety rising up inside me. I wondered if maybe he had found a spot to just sit and think about whatever had been on his mind, or if he wasn't feeling well and just needed a few minutes alone. But something didn't feel right. 15 minutes turned to 30. I was starting to spiral. I called his phone, but it didn't go through. Mine barely had one bar. I didn't want to call in an emergency unless something was seriously wrong, but I also had no idea what was going on or what I was really doing out there. I didn't know the trail, didn't know how to confidently retrace our steps without him, and had no idea if he was coming back or if something had happened or if he got lost or whatever. So in a panic, I called 911. I told him I wasn't sure if it was an emergency yet, I just didn't know what to do. I gave them our location as best I could and the best directions I could give about where we had parked the car. Told them my friend had gone off the trail and hadn't come back. The dispatcher was super calming, told me to stay put, said they'd send someone out and maybe even send a ranger just to be safe. Then I heard something crashing through the woods. My friend came stumbling out of the trees, completely drenched in sweat, holding his knife out in front of him in this defensive posture. He was filthy, like he'd been rolling in the mud or on the forest floor or something, and he looked terrified. He charged up to me and grabbed me by the arm, accidentally knocking the phone out of my hand and almost barreling through me completely. He whispered to me that we had to leave right now. I picked up the phone and barely had time to register that the call had been disconnected when he just started dragging me down the trail, telling me that someone was out there, watching, and they were following us. I couldn't tell if he was joking at first, or having a bad trip or something. I asked him if he was sure it wasn't just the mushrooms messing with him. He wouldn't say anything else, just kept repeating that we had to go and pushing me back down the trail the way we had come. I didn't question him, I just started to panic and run behind him down the trail toward the car. There was no talking. Every minute or so he'd look over his shoulder or suddenly make us stop and whisper for us to listen like he had heard something, which was impossible over our running. I kept trying to tell him to calm down and that I had called 911, but he didn't seem to care. He was just singularly focused on getting out of the woods. At the trailhead, 2 cops were waiting near the car. My buddy completely locked up when they started asking questions, wouldn't make eye contact. Initially, he refused to speak, but then at a certain point gave me this paranoid look and asked to speak with them in private. I think this kind of put a flag up for them, but they obliged and walked him over to one of their cruisers where they talked to him by himself. During their conversation, I would occasionally see them glance over at me like they were talking about me. Then, one of the officers came over and talked to me privately and asked if I was the one that made the phone call. I told him yes and tried to explain what had happened. He asked me if Pete was on something. I told him the truth, but told him it wasn't any more than we'd done in the past. Then, he asked if Pete had any history of mental health problems, and all I could tell him was not that I knew of. They took our names and told us they'd check the trail just to be safe and to stay put. Pete just sat on the ground and never said a word. Wouldn't answer my questions, wouldn't tell me what he saw. They didn't find anything. No signs of anyone else there, no tracks, no gear, nothing. Just us. One of the officers pulled me aside and told me it might be a good idea for him to get evaluated, but that they couldn't make him. Afterwards, we drove back to my place in silence. He slept on the couch that night, but the next morning he was gone. I have no idea what time he left or whether it was even morning or in the middle of the night. I texted him a few times that week, and he replied only once, just a thumbs up emoji. After that, nothing. He stopped answering, stopped hanging out, deleted his social media and moved back in with his parents last I heard. Whatever happened out there broke something in him, and I still don't know what it was. I haven't seen him since that day.